This is the story of Eastern Airlines Flight 212. On the 11th of September 1974, an Eastern Airlines DC-9 was to fly from Charleston in South Carolina to Charlotte in North Carolina. At 7 a.m., the plane departed Charleston with 78 passengers and 4 crew members on board. This would be a short flight, and 22 minutes after takeoff, the crew of Flight 212 was in contact with Atlanta ARTCC. They cleared Flight 212 down to 8,000 feet. In the cockpit, the pilots were in contact with an operations service agent at Charlotte and 3 other Eastern Airlines planes headed into Charlotte. They were all talking about an in-range checklist that was mandated by Eastern Airlines. Within 10 minutes, this checklist was started and the ATC controller queried the pilots about their altitude. At that point, they were down to 10,000 feet on their descent down to 8,000 feet. With that, the plane was handed over to Charlotte approach, and the controller briefed them on the approach that they'd be flying. He also cleared them down to 6,000 feet. The captain completed the in-range checklist and said in range, to which the first officer just said, okay. As Flight 212 descended down to 6,000 feet, ATC asked the pilots to turn left to 360 degrees. As this approach was being flown, the pilots in the cockpit were talking about things that didn't necessarily pertain to the operation of the aircraft. After this left turn, ATC cleared the plane down to 4,000 feet and asked them to turn again, this time to 240 degrees. As the pilots slowed the plane, they brought out the flaps bit by bit. By the time Flight 212 had reached 3,000 feet, they had been handed over to the tower controller. Charlotte Tower informed the pilots that they were about 5 miles from a point known as Ross Intersection and that they were number 2 in line for landing. So far, this flight had been uneventful, boring even. It resembled every other flight that takes off and lands every minute of every day. But that would soon change. Within minutes, the captain stated, Ross 5.5, 1800. For the approach to runway 36, Ross Point is what's known as a final approach fix. At that final approach fix, you must have your plane in a particular state. You have to be at the right speed, at the right altitude, all that sort of stuff. It's a way to make sure that you're where you're supposed to be. This way, you're perfectly set up for a safe landing. At this point, the runway was about 10 miles away, and they'd be on the ground soon. On their way in, the pilots peered out of the cockpit, looking for the Carowinds. It's a tower in an amusement park near the flight path. It's very tall and has bright lights on it. Pilots can easily ID it from the air. With the tower positively ID'd, they dropped the gear. In the cockpit, there was a steady tone indicating that the plane was less than 1,000 feet above the ground. In the cockpit, final preparations were being made for the landing. Someone said 394. That was their minimum descent altitude, and the other pilot agreed. They then brought out the flaps to 50 degrees. The captain let the controller know that they were by the Ross intersection, and the controller gave Flight 212 their landing clearance. In the cockpit, the captain said, yeah, we're all ready. All we've got to do is find the airport. Yeah, the first officer said. 1.5 seconds after the yeah had been recorded, the CVR recorded both pilots shouting. Then it recorded silence. The aircraft had struck some trees just miles from runway 36. Of the 82 occupants on board, 10 people survived. Most of the flight was downright normal, boring even. Nothing suggested that they were in any kind of danger, not one bit. But the wreck short of runway 36 was proof that something had gone wrong, and when it did, no one on board knew about it. The investigators first looked at the plane itself. Had something mechanically gone wrong? Something that impacted the controllability of the airplane, maybe. They found no evidence for that. The plane was mechanically sound. The center of gravity, weights, all other parameters were fine. This DC-9 was airworthy. It should not have crashed short of the runway. They then changed their focus onto the approach itself. The first officer was the one at the controls, and the captain was the one monitoring. They honed in on the conversation between the two pilots. No, they weren't fighting or anything. They were talking about stuff like politics and used cars as the DC-9 cut through the thick fog as it made its way down to Charlotte. Both pilots expressed, quote, strong views and mild aggravation at the topics discussed. The investigators felt that this created a lax atmosphere in the cockpit. This casualness in the cockpit rubbed off on their work. For example, the captain didn't make a few callouts. Those callouts might have saved them. At this point in the approach, the pilots focused their attention outside the airplane. The pilots were looking out the window to spot the Carowinds Tower at the amusement park. But as they did that, the plane descended below 1,800 feet. Keep in mind, you had to be at 1,800 feet when you were at the final approach fix, but Flight 212 was yet to reach that point, and they went below 1,800 feet. In their search for the tower through the fog, they just didn't notice their altitude slipping. But the investigators could hear a tone in the cockpit. It was a warning letting the pilots know that they were just 1,000 feet above the ground. This tone should have alerted them to the problem that was starting to develop. They were nowhere near the final approach fix, so this altitude warning should not have sounded. But yet, they ignored it. Why? Apparently, a lot of pilots viewed the alarm as more of a nuisance than an actual warning. It was an annoying, repetitive tone rather than a voice that said warning, warning. So they didn't take the alarm too seriously, but it was telling them that they were way too low. Once the pilots focused their attention back into the airplane, the rate of descent of the plane went down from 1,500 feet per minute to 300 feet per minute. But this reduction wasn't enough. The plane passed through the Ross intersection, the final approach fix, at 1,350 feet instead of 1,800 feet. By the way, these altitudes are above sea level. In addition to being too high, they were too fast. They should have been at 122 knots when they were near the Ross intersection, but they were actually at 168 knots. At this point, the captain should have cross-checked their altitude and speed and should have seen that they were too low and too fast and called for a go-around or a correction at the very least. But thanks to the lax casual atmosphere in the cockpit, those callouts and calls were not made. Shortly after that, Flight 212 was just 500 feet above the ground. The captain should have made another callout, but he did not. Another opportunity to figure out that something was wrong was lost. The investigators could not understand how the crew was so unaware about their altitude. They were dangerously low, and no one had a clue. The investigators think that their lack of visual cues played a huge part. At the time of the accident, they had a hard time identifying external features as they were flying through some thick fog. Flight 212 was lower than other planes that had landed before it, so that put them deeper in the fog, and it was harder for them to gain a visual on things like the runway. The first officer's testimony also gave them some insight into what happened. After the whole Carowinds discussion, he turned his attention to the instruments. There he saw that the altimeter's pointer was between the numbers 6 and 7, so he just assumed that the plane was at 1,670 feet above the ground. But actually, he misread the altimeter. They were probably just 670 feet above the ground. The captain at this point was just too busy with checklists to notice the first officer's mistake. Ultimately, their talks sowed the seeds of this crash, setting off a chain of events that ended with the crash. Right from the start of this approach, it was clear that their attention was divided between their conversations and actually flying the plane. The NTSB said that this crash came down to poor cockpit discipline. Their one recommendation was to find ways to improve professional standards among pilots. Years after this crash, in 1981, the FAA published the sterile cockpit rules, The sterile cockpit rules stated that you could only talk about topics pertaining to flying and safe operation of the plane below 10,000 feet. So, if you had some really nice pizza the night before, you'd have to wait a bit before you could tell your fellow pilot. What do you think is the main cause for this accident? Do you think it was their conversations distracting them, or them not noticing their altitude because they were looking out the window looking for the tower? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to watch another video, I highly recommend my video about a sick passenger who almost caused a mid-air collision. You can find a link to that on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.